6 armed officers stormed the executive floor with no warrant and no explanation, and every eye in the building landed on one name. They dragged Chief Executive Officer Marlo Bennett out of her own chair, twisted her arms back, and locked steel cuffs around her wrists, while her staff stood frozen, too stunned to move. Police Chief Calvin Rourke ground his boot into her private files and sneered that a woman like her could never own a place like this. Then, as the elevator began to seal her away, a stranger's hand shot between the doors, a federal badge flashed, and one whispered code name stopped the entire floor, cold, unraveling everything Rourke had spent 3 years trying to bury. The morning had begun like any other inside the headquarters of Bennett Meridian Technologies, a company that built data security systems for hospitals, banks, and government agencies across the state of Maryland. Marlo sat in a closed-door meeting with her chief counsel Tessa Holloway and her head of corporate security Grant Mercer, reviewing a set of irregular payments buried inside a municipal security contract. In front of her lay a black folder marked with the code N17, containing forged invoices, wire transfer records, and a list of city officials who had quietly accepted money from a private bank called Prescott Capital. She was scheduled to hand the final version of that folder to federal prosecutor Everett Sloan at exactly 9:30, and every minute before that deadline mattered more than she let her face show. At 9:12, the private elevator opened, and 6 officers, led by Chief Calvin Rourke, walked straight past the reception desk without checking in with security and without presenting a single legal document. Grant stepped forward immediately and asked to see a warrant, but 2 officers pinned him against the wall before he could finish the sentence. Rourke announced that his department had received a tip about a woman impersonating a chief executive, breaking into an executive office, and stealing confidential company files, and he said it loudly enough for every employee on the floor to hear. Marlo rose calmly from her seat and stated her name and her position without raising her voice, but Rourke looked her up and down, noted her plain blazer and the absence of an assistant trailing behind her, and told her that someone dressed the way she was could not possibly own a billion-dollar corporation. Delaney Frost, the company's chief operating officer, appeared at the far end of the hallway and did nothing to intervene, instead lifting her phone and quietly filming the officers as they restrained her own chief executive. Rourke snatched the black folder off the desk, and Marlo warned him that the documents inside belonged to an active federal investigation and that opening them would be a serious mistake. He laughed in her face, accused her of trying to intimidate a police officer, and gave the order for 2 of his men to cuff her wrists behind her back while she offered no resistance at all, her eyes fixed instead on the clock mounted above the doorway. Grant noticed the calm in her expression and realized she was waiting for someone, though he had no idea who. As the officers pulled her toward the elevator, she leaned close to Rourke and told him quietly that he had just put his hands on something he had spent 3 years trying to hide. And for a single flickering second, his confidence cracked before he barked at his men to move her downstairs. The elevator doors were sliding shut when a hand caught them from the outside, and federal prosecutor Everett Sloan stepped through with 2 federal agents flanking him. He looked at the handcuffs around Marlo's wrists, then at the folder clutched in Rourke's hand, and asked in a flat, cold voice which one of them had just arrested a protected witness, known only by the name North Star. The hallway fell into complete silence, and Rourke pretended not to recognize the name at all, insisting his department was simply handling a corporate break-in. Everett demanded the cuffs be removed immediately and the folder placed back on the desk, but Rourke refused, claiming local police had full authority over the situation. Everett produced his Department of Justice credentials and announced in front of every employee still standing frozen in the hallway that Marlo Bennett was the founder of Bennett Meridian, that she personally controlled 68% of the company's voting shares, that the executive floor belonged exclusively to her, and that she was a federally protected witness operating under the codename North Star. Any interference with her, he said, could constitute obstruction of a federal investigation, a charge that carried serious prison time. A young officer near the back immediately stepped away, but Rourke tried to hold his ground, claiming corporate records already listed Delaney Frost as the acting chief executive. Tessa checked the internal system on her tablet and discovered that Marlowe's name had been quietly removed from the company portal at 8:47 that morning, with administrative control transferred to Delaney's account instead. Delaney feigned shock, suggesting the company might have suffered a cyber attack overnight, though her voice lacked any real surprise. Marlowe studied Delaney's wrist and noticed a small metal bracelet, the kind Prescott Capital gave, only to its closest board allies, and filed the detail away without a word. Everett asked Rourke, who had placed the call to dispatch that morning, and Rourke claimed the tip had come from an anonymous source he could not disclose. Grant pulled up the building's security log and found that the call had not come from outside at all, but from a landline inside Delaney's own conference room. When confronted, Delaney insisted her assistant must have made the call, though everyone in the room knew she had no assistant scheduled that morning. Everett ordered the executive floor sealed, and Rourke objected loudly that a federal prosecutor had no authority over local police procedure, though the argument sounded weaker with every word. Everett reminded him that this was no longer a corporate dispute, and that the folder in his hand contained evidence already submitted to a federal grand jury. Marlowe asked that her cuffs be removed, but did not demand Rourke's immediate arrest, choosing instead to let him keep talking because every lie he told in that hallway was becoming evidence against himself. Everett reached inside the collar of Marlowe's blazer and unclipped a small hidden pin that had recorded the entire raid from the moment the elevator doors first opened. It captured Rourke's remark about a woman like her never owning a place like this, along with his admission that he had received insider information before the raid began. Everett turned to face him directly and told him that he had not walked into that office to arrest an imposter, but to steal evidence against himself. And the words landed in the silent hallway like a verdict already delivered. Rourke was escorted toward the stairwell, under the watch of 2 federal agents still insisting loudly that his department had followed proper procedure, though nobody in the lobby believed him anymore. Employees who had watched the entire scene unfold from behind glass partitions slowly stepped back into the hallway, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. Marlowe rubbed her wrists once, thanked Everett quietly, and told him she needed exactly 1 hour before she could sit down and discuss the next phase of the investigation. She walked back toward her office, with her spine straight and her expression unreadable, refusing to let the shock she felt show on her face in front of her own staff. Even after the cuffs came off, Marlowe's control over her own company had not yet been restored, and Delaney seized the opening to call an emergency board meeting before the morning was over. She told the assembled directors that Marlowe had endangered the business by secretly sharing internal data with the federal government without board approval, framing the entire raid as evidence of instability rather than injustice. Several nervous board members worried aloud that the city might cancel its contract with the company if the investigation became public knowledge. Delaney proposed suspending Marlowe, immediately citing vague concerns about mental fitness and her confrontation with police, and for a moment the room seemed ready to agree. Marlowe did not raise her voice, only asked which bylaw allowed a minority shareholder to suspend the company's controlling founder, and the silence that followed told her the resolution had no real legal ground. Delaney produced a document bearing electronic signatures from 4 board members, but Tessa examined the file and discovered all 4 signatures had been generated within the same 60 seconds from the exact same network address. That address traced directly back to the servers of Prescott Capital, and Marlowe finally understood the full architecture of the plot unfolding around her. Delaney had cut off her access to company systems. Rourke had sent officers to arrest her on a false impersonation charge. The black folder had been seized to disappear, and the board had been manipulated into declaring her mentally unfit to run the very company she built, all so that Prescott Capital could pressure a forced sale of her shares at a fraction of their worth, leaving the corruption network free to continue without a witness, watching from inside. Delaney fought back by releasing the video of the handcuffing to the internal company network, insisting the footage had already damaged investor confidence beyond repair. Within minutes, it leaked to outside media under a headline claiming a woman posing as a chief executive had been arrested at a technology firm, and the story spread far faster than the truth ever could. The company's private valuation dropped sharply as investors panicked, and three major clients demanded immediate explanations before the day was even over. Marlowe realized her enemies wanted more than the documents in that folder. They wanted her credibility destroyed before the truth could ever catch up to the lie. Everett offered to move her to a secure location, but she refused to leave the building, knowing that walking away now would only help Delaney tighten her grip on the company. Standing before the board, Marlowe told them plainly that they had used police officers to drag her out of that chair, and that if they wanted to keep her out of it permanently, they would have to prove in a courtroom that she had never built the company at all. Tessa opened the original incorporation file stored in the company archive and discovered that a critical page had been quietly swapped for a forgery. The replacement page granted Delaney temporary control of the company in the event Marlowe ever became the subject of a criminal investigation, a clause that had never existed in the true founding documents. The only surviving copy of the authentic page was locked inside a safety deposit box at Prescott Capital, sealed under a bank that had every reason not to cooperate. The story then reached back 16 years, to a time before Marlowe Bennett had ever built anything of her own when she worked as a cybersecurity analyst for a technology contractor serving hospital systems across the region. She discovered the firm had quietly cut corners on hospital security to boost quarterly profits, endangering patient records for the sake of a bigger margin, and when she raised the alarm to leadership, she was told to stay quiet and keep her head down. Instead, Marlowe resigned, emptied her entire savings account, and rented a small office where she began building Bennett Meridian from nothing but a laptop and a stubborn refusal to give up. She had no powerful investors, no family connections, and no shortage of banks that rejected her loan applications, because she did not look like the founder they expected to see walk through their doors. She kept building anyway, coding the first version of her product alone, meeting with skeptical clients in person, and staying up through the night to fix bugs that no one else believed in. There were nights she slept on a folding cot in the back of that tiny rented office, waking before sunrise to answer emails from hospital administrators who doubted a company that small could ever protect their patient records. She learned to write her own contracts before she could afford a lawyer, taught herself the language of municipal procurement so no city official could talk over her in a meeting, and turned down 2 buyout offers early on because she refused to hand over control of something she had built with her own hands. Every setback taught her something new about the industry, and every rejection sharpened the pitch she gave the next investor, who agreed to sit across the table from her. Grant Mercer was one of her earliest hires, and Tessa Holloway joined soon after, helping her fight off a lawsuit that tried to seize the patent she had built with her own hands. Bennett Meridian slowly earned a reputation for airtight security, eventually landing contracts with hospitals, banks, and the city government of Belhaven itself, proof that persistence had outlasted every closed door. 3 years before the raid that would upend her life, Marlowe discovered that one of the company's municipal contracts had been inflated by $40 million beyond its actual cost. The system should have cost $12 million to build, yet the city had approved more than $50 million, with the difference funneled through a chain of consulting firms that eventually landed back at Prescott Capital. When Marlowe refused to sign off on the inflated contract, local police suddenly opened 3 separate inspections into her company within the same month. Grant noticed his car being followed. Tessa began receiving anonymous threats in the mail, and a server holding audit data was targeted for theft, though the attempt failed because Marlowe had encrypted everything months earlier out of pure caution. She reached out to the Department of Justice and met Everett Sloan, and to protect the investigation, she accepted a classified code name known only to a handful of federal officials, North Star. In public, she continued running her company exactly as she always had, while privately gathering a mountain of evidence that included inflated invoices, private emails between Delaney and Prescott, records of payments funneled toward Chief Rourke, footage of police officers quietly moving a seized server to a private storage facility, and forged contracts used to fund personal interests with taxpayer money. She understood that cooperating with federal investigators could cost her everything she had built. Yet she believed that staying silent would put thousands of hospital patients and public clients directly in harm's way. Back in the present, Everett informed Marlowe that the folder she had prepared to hand over that morning was only a duplicate copy, and that the master data still sat safely on an offline storage device hidden somewhere. Only she knew about. The only other person who had ever come close to guessing that location was Delaney Frost, and that single fact suddenly made every next move far more dangerous than either of them wanted to admit. The leaked video spread through every corner of the city within hours, but the version circulating online had been carefully edited to remove Rourke's prejudiced remark entirely. What remained showed only Marlowe arguing with police and warning them about a federal investigation, and local commentators quickly painted her as an arrogant executive using political connections to dodge a legitimate arrest. Brielle Maddox, an investigative reporter for the Belhaven Ledger, received the video from an anonymous account and initially planned to run the story exactly as the police department had framed it. But she noticed the timestamp on the footage began 17 minutes later than the actual emergency dispatch log, a discrepancy too precise to be an accident. Digging further, she traced the leaked video back to a server registered under Prescott Capital, a detail that had no obvious reason to exist unless someone wanted the story told a very particular way. Rourke called a press conference and announced that his department had acted on credible information, suggesting Marlowe was stealing sensitive client data conveniently, leaving out that she was the company's founder and a protected federal witness. Delaney appeared beside him as the company's temporary representative, expressing manufactured concern over Marlowe's behavior and promising full cooperation with the investigation. Inside the building, Marlowe found herself locked out of her own server room, her access badge deactivated, her email account frozen, and her name scrubbed entirely from the corporate website within a matter of hours. A growing number of confused employees began to wonder if the woman they had trusted for over a decade had somehow betrayed them all along. Grant wanted to release the full recording captured by the hidden pin, but Everett stopped him, explaining that the recording was federal evidence and that releasing it too early could tip off other suspects still under investigation, giving them time to destroy their own paper trails. Marlowe faced an impossible choice between defending her reputation immediately and protecting a far larger case that stretched well beyond her own company. She chose to stay silent, and the decision cost her dearly. As online commentary grew crueler by the hour, with strangers questioning how a black woman could possibly own a corporation that size without someone else secretly pulling the strings behind her, Marlowe read every comment without responding to a single one, quietly saving screenshots of every account later traced back to networks connected with Prescott Capital. Brielle reached out privately to Tessa, revealing that she believed the video had been deliberately altered and requesting a meeting away from cameras and colleagues. Tessa handed her public incorporation records, proving Marlowe had founded the company from scratch, though she withheld any mention of the ongoing federal investigation for the moment. Brielle began interviewing longtime employees one by one, and every single person she spoke to confirmed the same unshakable truth: that Marlowe Bennett had built the company with her own hands, long before anyone else ever set foot inside it. When Brielle finally traced the very first account to spread the false impersonation claim, she found it had been created using the email address of a sergeant who reported directly to Chief Rourke, a discovery that turned her private suspicion into something she could finally begin to prove. Tessa secured an emergency court order to access the safety deposit box at Prescott Capital, where the original founding documents were supposedly stored, after a judge agreed there was reasonable evidence of corporate forgery. Marlowe, Tessa Everett, and 2 federal agents arrived at the bank, where Vaughn Prescott greeted them with a calm that felt just a little too rehearsed for the circumstances. The box was opened in front of a security camera, and inside they found nothing at all, the space completely empty. Vaughn claimed Bennett Meridian had already withdrawn the documents 3 days earlier, and the sign-out sheet listed a signature reading Marlowe Bennett in handwriting that looked almost identical to her own. Marlowe studied the signature closely and pointed out a single detail. No forger had thought to correct. She always wrote the letter B in Bennett, with one continuous stroke, while the signature on the withdrawal slip used two separate strokes. Instead, the bank's surveillance footage from that exact time window had conveniently been marked as under maintenance, a coincidence too tidy to be believed. Everett seized the surveillance server, and federal technicians managed to recover a fragment of deleted footage buried deep in the system. The recovered image showed Delaney Frost entering the vault, wearing a wig and dark sunglasses waved through by a bank manager who never bothered to verify her identity, a manager who had recently received $85,000 from a consulting firm tied directly to Vaughn. Delaney began to panic once she learned the footage had been recovered, calling Rourke and demanding he protect her from what was coming. Rourke told her there was one final task left to deliver the offline storage device containing the North Star files to him before midnight, no matter what it took. Grant managed to record the entire call through the company's secure phone system, since Delaney had foolishly continued using her corporate line for conversations that should have stayed far away from any recorded network. Marlowe revealed that the offline device had never been inside that safety deposit box at all, and that she had deliberately let Delaney believe otherwise, hoping the false trail would finally force her into a mistake she couldn't take. Back! The real device sat hidden inside an old decommissioned server, kept on display in the company's history exhibit, a detail Delaney had once glimpsed Marlowe checking, and had quietly filed away for later. That night, Delaney returned to headquarters and used her temporary executive authority to order security away from the display floor entirely. Grant tracked her movements through a backup camera system she had no idea even existed, watching every step from a small monitoring room down the hall. Delaney pried open the old server casing and pulled out a small silver device, but when she turned around, Chief Calvin Rourke was already standing behind her. Instead of reaching for the device, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped down the door handle for fingerprints, and told her flatly that she had just become the only person left who could testify against him. Rourke locked the exhibit room door and demanded she hand over the device immediately, and Delaney realized in that instant that he intended to stage the entire scene to make her the sole culprit behind everything. He laid out exactly how the evidence would read: that she had forged Marlowe's signature and placed the call to dispatch, retrieved the empty documents from the bank, stolen a piece of federal evidence, and manipulated the entire board of the dock directors, while nothing in the paper trail would ever point back to him giving the orders. Delaney threatened to expose their private text messages, but Rourke calmly informed her that her phone was already synced to a police department server, capable of wiping every message remotely, leaving her with absolutely nothing to hold over him. In the monitoring room down the hall, Grant and Everett watched the exchange unfold, waiting for the right moment to intervene, so that Rourke would be forced to incriminate himself out loud. Marlowe stood beside them, and despite everything Delaney had done, she had no interest in letting Rourke destroy her or pin the entire scheme on one desperate woman. Using the building's internal speaker system, Marlowe called out Rourke's name, and his shock was immediate as her voice echoed through the room he thought was completely private. She told him plainly that the room was being recorded through an independent system he had never accounted for, and while he scrambled to smash the main camera in the corner, he never noticed the 4 smaller lenses hidden inside the thermal sensors along the ceiling. Marlowe walked calmly into the hallway outside the exhibit room, unarmed and entirely unafraid, and told Rourke that the device in Delaney's hand held nothing more than an empty storage shell. The actual North Star data had already been transferred to a federal grand jury early that morning, mere minutes before his officers had ever stepped off the elevator. The raid had never had any real chance of stopping the investigation. It had only succeeded in proving a deliberate conspiracy to obstruct justice. Rourke's composure finally cracked, and he admitted out loud that he had cleaned up plenty of other businesses over the years, but had never once encountered anyone brave enough to stand against him the way she just had. It was exactly the confession Everett had been waiting to hear. Federal agents stepped through the door and arrested Rourke on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to steal federal evidence, and witness intimidation, reading him his rights while he stood frozen against the very wall he had used to intimidate Grant only days earlier. Delaney surrendered. The device begged for protection and offered to cooperate fully with whatever came next. Marlowe looked at her for a long moment and told her that she hadn't betrayed her out of fear, but because she believed the chair Marlowe sat in was worth more than the truth itself. Before officers led him away, Rourke turned back and warned Marlowe that he was far from the highest name in the network, his eyes drifting toward the tall glass tower of Prescott Capital standing across the street. In the days that followed Rourke's arrest, Vaughn Prescott moved quickly to deploy a full legal team, publicly claiming he barely knew the chief beyond a handful of charity events around the city. Prescott Capital denied any illegal payments whatsoever, and the money trail had been carefully routed through a maze of shell companies designed to make any direct link to Vaughn nearly impossible to prove. Delaney agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency, handing over meeting schedules, access codes, and a small notebook that recorded every instruction Vaughn had ever given her. Unfortunately, the notebook contained only cryptic symbols, instead of full names, leaving Everett still searching for something that could tie Vaughn directly to the order behind Marlowe's arrest. Brielle published her first major exposé, laying out in careful detail that Marlowe was the legitimate founder of Bennett Meridian, that police had acted without any warrant or search order, that the leaked video had been deliberately edited before release, that the account responsible for spreading it belonged to an officer under Rourke's direct command, and that Delaney had a documented financial relationship with Prescott Capital, stretching back years. Public opinion began to shift almost overnight. Employees gathered in the lobby of Bennett Meridian, demanding the board immediately restore Marlowe's full authority over the company she had built from nothing. The board had little choice but to void the suspension resolution, once Tessa proved beyond doubt that the electronic signatures behind it had all been forged from the same source. Marlowe returned to her office to find her chair pushed askew, papers scattered across the floor, and Rourke's boot prints still faintly visible near her desk. She didn't sit down right away, choosing instead to gather each scattered document by hand, sorting them carefully, while instructing her staff to preserve every second of raid footage as evidence for what was still to come. Grant discovered a deleted audio file buried in Delaney's computer, created only hours before the raid had even begun. Federal technicians recovered the conversation between Vaughn and Delaney, and though Vaughn never once used Marlowe's actual name, he referred to her repeatedly, using a peculiar phrase, the North Star. He had instructed Delaney to make certain the North Star was no longer sitting on the 42nd floor by the time the markets opened that morning, a phrase that proved Vaughn already knew the classified code name North Star, information that should have been impossible for anyone outside the investigation or a witness's own surveillance to ever obtain. Everett immediately filed for a federal arrest warrant against Vaughn Prescott. When agents arrived at Prescott Capital to execute it, Vaughn had already vanished, leaving nothing behind on his desk except a single sealed envelope addressed to Marlowe herself. Inside was an old key to the tiny office where she had first started her company, along with a handwritten note claiming that since she had built everything from nothing once before, he could easily send her right back to that same starting point. Federal agents located Vaughn at a private airfield just before his aircraft was scheduled to depart, and he insisted the flight had been booked long in advance and had nothing to do with fleeing prosecution. An emergency federal hearing was called to determine whether he posed a flight risk and whether he had attempted to intimidate a protected witness. The courtroom filled quickly with employees of Bennett Meridian, members of the press, and representatives from several other businesses that had once been pressured by the very same police department. Vaughn's legal team tried to frame the entire case as nothing more than a corporate rivalry, painting Marlowe as an ambitious executive who had weaponized the federal government against a wealthy competitor. Marlowe took the witness stand and calmly walked the courtroom through everything she had discovered, from the inflated municipal contract to her decision to cooperate quietly with federal investigators rather than expose the fraud publicly and risk losing the evidence entirely. She kept her testimony focused not on the personal insults she had endured, but on how the stolen money had drained security funding meant to protect hospitals and public agencies across the city. When asked why she hadn't revealed her identity as North Star sooner, she answered simply that corrupt men rarely fear someone speaking out loud. What truly frightens them is the evidence that person has quietly kept hidden. Everett played the full recording captured during the raid, and the courtroom listened in stunned silence as Rourke's voice declared that a woman like her could never own a place like this. Followed moments later by his confession inside the exhibit room, and the recovered conversation between Delaney and Vaughn. Everett then presented the full financial trail, showing how Prescott Capital had funneled payments through 3 separate consulting firms, which in turn paid into a fund controlled by one of Rourke's closest associates. A portion of that money had been used to purchase real estate registered under the names of relatives belonging to several officers, and new payments appeared almost immediately after any business that refused to cooperate suddenly found itself under police pressure. Delaney took the stand and admitted she had helped forge company documents because Vaughn had promised to install her permanently as chief executive once Marlowe was removed. Rourke, realizing Vaughn intended to let him take the full blame alone, agreed to cooperate as well rather than face the consequences by himself. Vaughn lost his composure entirely, shouting that Marlowe could never have run her company without his capital behind her. And Marlowe answered without raising her voice that Prescott Capital had only invested after her company was already profitable, and that he had never built anything himself. He had only ever tried to seize what someone else had already created. Several other witnesses followed Marlowe to the stand over the course of that long afternoon, including 2 city officials who admitted under oath that they had approved the inflated contract only after receiving veiled threats about future inspections targeting their own family businesses. A former bank employee testified that she had been instructed never to question large cash deposits tied to certain consulting firms, an instruction that had come directly from a supervisor with close ties to Vaughn. One by one, the pieces of the network fell into place before the entire courtroom, each testimony reinforcing the last until the picture became impossible for anyone to deny. Even Vaughn's own attorneys seemed to lose their footing as the afternoon wore on, offering fewer objections and shorter cross-examinations as the weight of the evidence continued to build. By the time the prosecution rested its case for the day, there was no longer any real question left about what had actually happened on the 42nd floor that morning. The judge denied Vaughn bail entirely, citing a clear risk of flight and a documented history of witness intimidation. Rourke was stripped of his command while awaiting formal trial, and Delaney was charged with conspiracy to commit document forgery, unauthorized computer access, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The following morning, Brielle's front-page story ran alongside a photograph of Marlowe, walking out of the courthouse without a single handcuff in sight, beneath a headline declaring that they had called her an imposter, but an entire city had been built on a lie of its own. 6 months later, the North Star investigation had produced a long list of federal charges that reached far beyond a single corrupt police chief. Vaughn Prescott was formally indicted on counts of bribing public officials, defrauding a government contract, laundering money through shell corporations, obstructing justice, conspiring to intimidate a federal witness, and falsifying corporate financial records. Calvin Rourke accepted a partial plea agreement in exchange for handing over a complete list of officers and officials who had participated in the same corruption network for years. 3 other businesses that had once been pressured into selling off their assets under similar circumstances had their old cases quietly reopened for review. Delaney reached her own plea agreement, accepting a prison sentence and financial restitution, rather than risking a full trial, and before sentencing, she sent a private letter of apology to Marlowe. Marlowe never responded to her personally, instead sending a single line through her attorney, stating that forgiveness could never replace accountability. The city of Belhaven launched its own internal review of the police department, ultimately replacing nearly a third of its command staff, and installing an independent oversight board tasked with monitoring how warrants and emergency calls were issued going forward. Several of the officers who had accompanied Rourke that morning were reassigned pending review, while 2 others resigned entirely rather than face the questions waiting for them. Prescott Capital was placed under a lengthy federal monitorship, its remaining executives required to submit to outside audits for years to come, and the bank's name slowly disappeared from the city's list of preferred municipal partners. Bennett Meridian slowly recovered from the crisis, and several clients who had initially walked away returned once the full truth had finally come to light. Marlowe went on to launch an independent division within her company, dedicated to helping small businesses protect their data and safely report corruption without fear of retaliation. She spent weeks meeting privately with smaller business owners across the city, who had once been too afraid to speak up about similar pressure campaigns, listening to stories that mirrored her own far more closely than she had ever expected. Many of them had never reported anything at all, convinced that no one with real power would ever believe them over a badge or a boardroom. Marlowe made it her personal mission to change that assumption, funding a legal hotline that connected small business owners directly with federal resources whenever they suspected corruption in a public contract. She also rewrote portions of the company's founding charter to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. No single individual would ever be allowed to suspend the founder's authority without direct, verified confirmation. Every interaction with law enforcement would now be logged automatically and permanently. Whistleblower data would be backed up entirely outside the company's own internal systems. An independent ethics board would be granted the authority to report concerns directly to federal regulators without needing anyone's prior approval. During the company's first full staff meeting after the case, concluded Marlowe stood in the very spot where officers had once forced handcuffs onto her wrists. The executive chair sat empty behind her, but she chose not to sit down. She told her employees that a title never made anyone a true leader, and that neither an office, nor company shares, nor a name printed on a glass door could ever define a person's worth. What defined true leadership, she said, was how someone responded the moment power was used against them to force their silence. Grant asked if she wanted the small worn patch of carpet, still bearing scuff marks from the raid, replaced with something new. Marlowe decided to keep a small section of it, instead framing it and hanging it inside the conference room, beneath a simple plaque that read the day they tried to drag the truth out of this room. Everett visited headquarters once the case had fully closed, returning the small recording pin she had once hidden beneath her blazer collar. He told her that North Star no longer needed to exist, since her true identity had already been made public for the entire world to see. Marlowe looked out over the city skyline and told him that North Star had never really been an identity at all. It had always been a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something still had to exist to point the way forward. She stepped into the very elevator where she had once been dragged away in handcuffs, and this time the doors opened calmly onto the ground floor lobby, where hundreds of her employees stood quietly on either side in a gesture of unspoken respect. A group of younger employees, many of them women who had joined the company specifically after hearing what Marlowe had endured, gathered near the entrance, holding nothing more than quiet applause and a few handwritten signs of support. Grant stood off to one side watching the lobby fill with people who had once doubted the stories circulating about their own chief executive, now standing there simply to show her they finally understood the truth. Even the receptionist who had once whispered doubts to a coworker on the morning of the raid now stood near the front, arms crossed, nodding quietly as Marlowe passed. Tessa handed Marlowe a single folder, the very last piece of paperwork tied to the case, and told her with a small smile that it was the final signature she would ever need to give on the matter. Outside the building, Brielle asked Marlowe how it felt to finally reclaim both her company and her reputation. Marlowe answered that she had never really needed to reclaim her own identity at all. She had simply forced the people around her to admit that her identity had never belonged to their judgment in the first place. She walked through the glass doors bearing the company's name, Bennett Meridian Technologies, and the moment lingered there, quiet and certain. They once saw a black woman standing inside a polished executive office and assumed she did not belong there. They never understood that she had personally designed every security system, signed every major contract, and laid the foundation beneath every layer of power surrounding her. A pair of handcuffs held her wrists for only a few minutes, but nothing could erase 16 years of everything she had built with her own two hands. And when the truth finally broke into the light, the very men who had once dragged her out of her own chair were left standing in a courtroom, forced to explain exactly why they believed their power could ever outweigh justice itself.